Candlelight flickers in the darkness. A quill scratches faintly. The king is writing, not laws, not decrees, but goodbye. He is alone now. No throne, no velvet, just cold stone and parchment. Louis XVI, once King of France, sits in his cell at the Temple prison, January 20th, 1793. Tomorrow morning he will be executed, guillotined before a silent crowd. He dips the quill again. His hand trembles. I forgive those who are guilty of my death. I pray that God will not punish my people. But the people already have. The revolution that once promised justice now thirsts for blood, and the first to bleed will be their king. This is not a tale of war and triumph. It's a story of a man unmade by his own throne. A ruler too soft for fire, too slow for chaos. Born into luxury, crowned in splendor, but led by fear, silence, and fatal indecision. This is the story of how Louis XVI collapsed, one mistake at a time. How a weak king's blunders, one after another, cracked the foundations of a kingdom. How his silence, secrets, and slow betrayals turned a crown into a curse. We will follow this descent, from golden halls to blood-stained scaffolds. We will watch power decay, decisions falter, and history change shape under pressure. And in the end, when the blade falls, we will understand. Louis did not die because he was cruel. He died because he waited too long to choose. It began with a lie, or perhaps a delusion. In June 1791, the streets of Paris awoke to a hollow silence. The guards outside the royal apartments were confused. The servants panicked. Louis XVI was gone. So was Marie Antoinette. The Dauphin, too. The royal family had fled under cover of night, dressed not in velvet or silk, but in plain clothes disguised as a bourgeois family. A valet played the part of a nobleman. The king himself, demoted to a servant, sat quietly at the front of the carriage. It was not an escape of grandeur, but desperation. Their destination, Montmédy, a military stronghold near the Austrian border where royalist troops loyal to the crown still waited. If they could make it there, Louis could rally an army and crush the revolution from without. But Paris would not let them go so easily. For a man who ruled millions, Louis had a fatal flaw. He could not read the people. His flight wasn't just clumsy, it was arrogant. The carriage was heavy, slow, far too ornate for stealth. And then, the final blow. At Varennes, a local postmaster recognized the king's face from a coin. The guards arrested the royal family and turned them back toward Paris. When Louis returned, the crowds were no longer chanting. They were watching, judging. Something had changed. This was not a king trying to lead. This was a king trying to escape his own people. And for the revolutionaries, it was nothing less than treason. The National Assembly now faced a question it had hoped to avoid. Could a king who abandoned his nation still be trusted to rule it? Over the following months, Louis's silence grew louder. Secret letters surfaced, messages between him and foreign powers like Austria and Prussia, urging them to invade France and restore his authority. Whether out of fear, delusion, or misplaced loyalty to monarchic bloodlines, Louis had chosen to bet against his own people. In 1792, France went to war, not just with Europe, but with itself. Paranoia flooded the streets. Political clubs turned into militias. Neighbors reported neighbors. The revolution was no longer a dream. It was a fever. Amid the chaos, the monarchy was abolished. The republic was born, and the former king, now addressed simply as Citizen Louis Capet, stood alone before his nation, not as a ruler, but as an accused criminal. His trial was not a show. It was a reckoning. The charges, high treason, conspiracy with foreign enemies, crimes against the liberty of the French people. His defense was hesitant, polite, full of legal nuance. But history had moved beyond nuance. When the vote was cast in the convention, it was final. Louis XVI would die. On January 21st, 1793, the king was led through the streets of Paris. The air was sharp and still. Eyewitnesses noted he climbed the scaffold with dignity. Some said his hands trembled slightly as he removed his coat. Others claimed he tried to speak, to defend himself one last time, but the drummers drowned out his voice. The blade fell. The square fell silent. In that moment, Europe gasped. Not because a king had died, but because a nation had killed him. The monarchy was no more, but something darker had been awakened. Louis XVI's execution did not end the revolution. It unshackled it. Within months, Marie Antoinette would follow. The reign of terror would begin, where enemies were everywhere, and the guillotine never rested. The man who couldn't choose became the symbol of a nation that had chosen violence. And behind every drop of blood spilled in those months, there was the ghost of a king, indecisive, isolated, and tragically human. Not evil, not heroic, just overwhelmed. A man crushed not only by his crown, but by the weight of a world he could no longer understand. And in that failure, history turned. The palace was no longer a sanctuary. Versailles was empty now, stripped of splendor, echoing with the memory of footsteps that once belonged to kings. Louis XVI, the once absolute monarch of France, now stood in a small stone chamber, no longer addressed as Your Majesty, but as Citizen Louis Capet. His title had been erased, but the hatred that followed it still burned in every gaze. The revolution had shifted from reform to revenge. When the royal family attempted their midnight escape, the ill-fated flight to Varennes, they did more than flee the capital. They fled their people, their promises, and their last shreds of legitimacy. Caught near the border in peasant disguise, Louis was dragged back to Paris like a criminal. The silent crowds that once waved at his golden carriage now stared with clenched fists and empty stomachs. By 1792, France was no longer a monarchy. It was a nation on the edge of a blade. The National Convention declared the Republic. The king was no longer king. And worse, he was now a traitor. Secret letters were discovered. Correspondence with Austria and Prussia, offering intelligence in exchange for military rescue. The people of France didn't just see cowardice now, they saw conspiracy. The trial was swift, the verdict inevitable. On December 11, 1792, Louis was brought before the convention, accused of undermining the revolution, of conspiring with foreign powers, and of betraying the very people he had sworn to protect. He denied nothing. He defended himself with tragic calm. "I am innocent. I forgive those who are guilty of my death." But his words were already irrelevant. The machinery of terror had begun to turn. On January 20th, 1793, the convention voted. 361 deputies chose death. 360 did not. A single vote sealed the fate of a king. The next morning, Louis awoke before dawn. Outside, the streets were filled with silence. Not reverence, but anticipation. At 10 a.m., he was led in a wooden cart through Paris, past cold-eyed crowds, past empty palaces, past the dream of divine right. His hands were bound, his hair shorn, his blue coat soaked with dew. The guillotine stood in the center of the Place de la Révolution. Red-stained, towering, waiting. As he ascended the scaffold, Louis tried to speak. "I die innocent of all the charges brought against me," he cried. "I forgive those who are responsible for my death." But the drums began to beat, not to drown out his words, but to erase them. At 10:22 a.m., the blade fell. His head dropped into the basket. A single executioner held it aloft. Blood poured down the wooden frame. For a moment, silence. Then cries. Then cheers. The monarch had become mortal, and mortality here meant spectacle. But the horror didn't end there. Weeks later, Marie Antoinette watched from her prison cell, her hair falling out in clumps, her dresses turned to rags. She had once ruled in silks and satins. Now she huddled under lice-ridden blankets and waited for the same fate. After Louis's death, the revolution only grew darker. The people had devoured their king, but their hunger, their fear, had only just begun. The guillotine became a daily ritual, no longer a symbol of justice, but of paranoia. Revolutionaries turned on each other. Neighbors denounced neighbors, and blood washed the cobblestones clean every morning. Louis's execution had opened the floodgates. Where once there had been monarchy, now there was a void, filled not with liberty, but with vengeance. His death was meant to bring peace. Instead, it ushered in the reign of terror, a year of purges, tribunals, and public executions, led by Robespierre and his Committee of Public Safety. They claimed virtue, they delivered death. And in the end, the blade that had ended Louis would find them too. The revolution had no loyalty, only a rhythm, one head then another. As Louis's blood soaked into the soil of the Republic, it fertilized something monstrous, a regime that claimed to represent the people, but ruled through fear, silence, and steel. His death was not the end of tyranny, it was its mutation. The king was dead, but France was not free. The crowd at the scaffold had roared when Louis's head dropped, but beneath the noise was something colder, quieter, the realization that the guillotine was no longer reserved for kings. Now it belonged to the people, In the weeks that followed, the revolution turned inward. Where once the enemy wore a crown, now it wore a neighbor's face. Marie Antoinette, once Madame Deficit, the foreign queen, was locked in a stone cell in the conciergerie, stripped of jewels, stripped of dignity. Her hair had turned white. Her children were taken. Her son, the Dauphin, was locked in a dark room and slowly destroyed. Alone, diseased, tormented. He died in silence. Marie was put on trial in October 1793. The charges were brutal: corruption, treason, even incest. A crime she denied with such horror that even hardened revolutionaries fell silent. But no denial could stop the verdict. She was executed on October 16th, dragged in an open cart through jeering crowds, her neck exposed to the wind, her once grand figure now reduced to a trembling ghost in a tattered chemise. The blade fell again. And with it, the revolution crossed a line it could never uncross. Robespierre rose. Once a voice of reason, Robespierre transformed into the architect of the Reign of Terror, a year-long nightmare that made the king's tyranny look gentle. From 1793 to 1794, the guillotine ran red. Every day, in every arrondissement. No one was safe. Not priests, not nobles, not revolutionaries, not citizens. To speak was to risk death. To remain silent was suspicious. To live was a daily negotiation with paranoia. The terror claimed over 16,000 lives by blade, and thousands more perished in prisons and extrajudicial killings. The executions were methodical, bureaucratic, signed into order like harvest quotas. They even had a calendar for it. Children watched as heads dropped. Women cheered or wept. Streets reeked of iron and fear. Executioners grew weary. Blades dulled. Justice became a factory. One body, then the next. And in this mechanical slaughter, Louis XVI's death became a distant echo, a spark that had ignited something far more monstrous than monarchy. Ideological purity enforced through steel. Robespierre preached virtue through terror. He called the guillotine the sword of the people. But even he could not control what he unleashed. Eventually, the crowd turned on him too. In July 1794, just 1 year after the Queen's death, Robespierre was arrested. His jaw was shattered in the struggle. He said nothing at his trial. The blade spoke for him. He died screaming through bloody gauze, the prophet of terror swallowed by his own machine. The guillotine had become a god. It devoured all. When the terror finally ended, France was exhausted, ruined. It had traded one form of tyranny for another, monarchy for mob rule, divine right for political purges. But something had changed permanently. The idea that power could be taken back, that kings could fall, that blood could rewrite history. And in that broken space where a crown once sat, rose a new shadow, Napoleon Bonaparte, the soldier who would turn revolution into empire. Louis XVI did not fall because he was cruel. He fell because he was weak, because he hesitated, because he believed the crown could protect him from change. But no crown is stronger than hunger, no title louder than rage. He died at the hands of his own people, not for what he did, but for what he failed to become, a king who could lead a nation in pain. His story ended in a basket beneath a scaffold, but the echo of that blade carried for centuries, across revolutions, across empires, across regimes that claimed to represent the people while silencing them just the same. Louis XVI is a ghost, not just in Versailles, but in every place where power forgets who gives it, where silence grows louder than speech, where fear replaces law, where the people, forgotten too long, remember and return. The blade fell, but the silence it left behind was louder than any anthem. Louis XVI's head dropped into the basket, and for a moment, all of France held its breath. The man who once ruled by divine right now lay decapitated in a public square, his blood soaking into the same soil that once kissed the heels of kings. But the revolution did not end there. It devoured its enemies and then its children. In the weeks that followed, Marie Antoinette too was marched through the streets, her hair hacked short, her dignity stripped bare. No longer a queen, just a widow, a prisoner, a mother torn from her children. Her execution was colder, quicker, but no less haunting. And then came the terror. Robespierre, the same man who demanded the king's head in the name of liberty, soon turned the guillotine on former allies. Trials became farce. Accusations required no proof. Neighbors betrayed neighbors. The air in Paris grew thick, not with incense or perfume, but with iron and blood. The people had torn down a monarchy only to build a scaffold. Louis XVI's death was meant to mark a new beginning, a republic born of reason and equality. But instead it opened a wound that refused to heal. For every noble killed, 1,000 commoners perished. For every tyrant toppled, a new one rose in their place. The monarchy fell because it refused to bend, but the revolution cracked because it refused to stop. And in that grim twilight, history did not write a happy ending. It painted a portrait in dried blood, broken crowns, and silent prayers. Louis was not a monster, but he was a failure. And the guillotine, for all its finality, did not fix the country he left behind. It only proved that a blade can kill a man, but it cannot kill what made him king.